Hey there, I'm Ryan. Welcome to today's acrylic landscape lesson. All of the tools and materials will be listed in the video description. And if you'd like help with the drawing process, I will have the traceable up over on Patreon along with the reference photo for color matching. If you're interested, check it out. But with that, let's jump into it and have some fun. So we're going to begin here today with a 1-inch flat-headed brush because it can carry and deliver quite a lot of paint for our backgrounds. We'll dip the bottom third of it in a little bit of water to help extend the wet life of our paint, allow us to blend for a longer period of time. And with that, here we have our palette. We have a titanium white and Mars black. I'm using them from Winsor & Newton. I have a cadmium red medium hue, cadmium yellow deep hue, which is just a little bit of a warmer yellow. And then we have Naples Yellow, which is a bit of a desaturated yellow, and all of these are from Liquitex Basics. That said, we are going to start at the bottom of our sky here, and I'll show you what that looks like on the reference photo. But I'll start by grabbing a little bit of red with the corner of my brush. I'll grab about double that in our cadmium yellow. Then we'll grab an equal amount of titanium white to the red that we initially grabbed, and the smallest hint of Mars black to desaturate it just a little bit, but you really don't want to use much Mars black because it's a very strong pigment and it will quickly take over your mix. With that, do a little quick test on my reference photo. Looks great. We'll come down here and we'll start applying that to the bottom, and in fact, even over a lot of our drawn trees. We're doing this very simply so that we get great coverage and we don't eventually have open areas in between the trees and the sky. It's also worth noting that we are working with acrylics here, and our first layers are going to be quite transparent, so we are going to go back and do this a couple of times once it dries. Just bring this all the way across. And then we'll start mixing our second color, which is a bit more yellow. So we want this to be a bit brighter than the last one, and we want it to be more yellow. So I'll use about half the amount of cadmium red, and we're still using some just so that we have a good transition. We'll use slightly more titanium white, and the smallest amount, yet again, of Mars black, though we have to be very careful because Mars black and yellow can make a bit of a green. The red in the mixture will also help us avoid that. But let's head back to the canvas. So we'll just start by applying this directly on top of our previous mixture and blend that down. I'm using very soft brush strokes so that I don't get streaks between the two. But you can see a heavy line. That is something we want to get rid of. So we'll continue mixing, this time taking about half of our previous mixture with some titanium white. We'll work that right here into the middle. This will make a much more thick pigment. Titanium white is really one of the most thick acrylics you can work with, and we'll have it dissipate as we go towards the edges because we want that sun, that light, to be more so in the middle. That said, we can always add more orange as well and go back and forth between the two until we have a nice, thick, proper application. This time I'm going to mix significantly more paint. Typically, with my first mixture, I don't mix all that much because it's a process of trial and error. And then once I find what I actually really like, then I go in with a whole lot more. So that's what we'll be doing here. See, I'm just tweaking my mix. Never really go in with the first color I end up with as a general rule, just because often it can be improved quite a lot. And we don't want to sacrifice the painting's final aesthetic look for a couple quicker applications. That said, as we bring that up, we of course lose our yellow. We'll remix that. And I guarantee you this is going to look a whole lot better with the second layer than it did in the first. I think often people are hesitant to go over layers they've already done because they don't want to mess it up, but going over those previously applied layers is often how you make it a brand new painting. Yet again, we'll get brighter. And I try to keep a bit of my previous mixture showing on the palette, just so I have a good reference for the new pigments. If I want to make it a little bit brighter or darker, I can refer to that. Again, we're going to the top, still covering all of the previous clouds that I've incorporated. And the trees, we can always draw them back on, but drawing them that first time helps us get a sense of where everything's going to be in the painting, and helps us do a better job long term, correct things if they need correcting. Here I'm going over all of it very softly. We'll take the excess paint off of our brush, and now we'll start working with the Naples Yellow as we continue to move higher. So I'll grab quite a lot of that, move it down here. We need to match the brightness of our previous pigment, so we'll grab titanium white to do that. That is really quite bright. Grab a hint of the previous mixture, blend those two together so that we have a good transition, and work that up here. Now we'll head back down. I'll try to keep it predominantly towards the left-hand side. There we go. Beautiful. Take the excess paint off my brush because in the process of moving down, we picked up a lot of orange and yellow. Now we'll grab significantly more titanium white, continue brightening this mixture, and I'm only going to mix with the bottom portion of the mix because the top portion has that in it, and I don't want this to actually have any of our cadmium yellow deep hue. Again, applying it to the top, blending down. But I do want the top to be a whole lot less strong. So now we'll grab a lot of titanium white, move that down here, just grab a little bit of that pre-existing Naples Yellow, have a lot of pigment on our brush, work that onto the top. Going to paint a big cloud right here, so I won't bring it up too much farther, but I do want to bring it up slightly past where the cloud's going to be so I can layer the cloud on top of the sky. And here you can see we're bringing it down, making it cohesive. Now we're going to start mixing our purples for the clouds, and we'll do so with a brand new color of deep violet. Here you can see that it's from Liquitex Basics, and I also have a round pointed brush. This is fantastic for clouds because the edges are soft, so they're great for little blends, but it also has a sharp tip for details. And with that, you can see that I've already started trying to do a couple little blends beforehand, but here we'll do it together. I'll grab some of that brand new deep violet. We'll start desaturating it by adding some titanium white and Mars black, about an equal mixture of both. The Mars black is a bit of a stronger pigment, so as you can see it will make for a darker mix, but these clouds aren't all that bright. And then we'll take about an equal amount of paint that we have here and double it with our cadmium red. So this should give us a nice dark purple, probably more so than what we need. Now, what do we do when we have that? We brighten it. We add some titanium white. Go back in for a nice little test. Certainly getting a lot closer. I like that, but I think you could have slightly more purple and slightly more red. Every time we add the titanium white and Mars black, we desaturate it a little bit. So we can just re-interject that. Work it back in, and I think that'll be fantastic. So let's head back over to the canvas. So the first very important step is to take off all of that excess paint we were just mixing with and get a nice clean brush, a clean damp brush to proceed with. We'll grab just a little bit of that paint. We won't need much for these clouds because they're really not all that big, but I'm going to look for essentially the top of each cloud, and I'll start painting in that area. These clouds are also going to have some orange mixed in with them a little bit later, but we're not there yet. And right now we're just going to do the base with this pigment. You can also probably tell as I move around here that I'm taking my pinky finger and I'm grounding it on the canvas to eliminate shake from my hand. Now I'll go ahead and do the bottom of this cloud. You might wonder, why do you do the bottom and the top? whenever I grab new paint, my brush is damp and I have the greatest ability to render detail and sharp edges. So I do that while I have that opportunity. Then when I start to run out of paint, like now, I'll move into the middle and just fill that out because it requires a lot less of a sharp stroke. With that, this is supposed to taper and then get a bit wider as we come down here. Yet again, covering up the drawing of our trees, I just did a little line for each of them so I could easily find it later. The majority of this is going to be painted over, and that's okay. Also, these clouds are going to look quite thin initially. Much like the actual sky, they will require a bit of layering to get them to look nice and professional. But that really is just working with acrylics, especially when we have semi-watery layers like I do now. And I'm just doing this so that I have a bit more control. There we go. It essentially looks like a line through the sky. That's okay. We have another little cloud right under it. Be a bit quicker with these in the first layer just because they don't have to be that tweaked yet. Just looking up at the reference photo, I have the drawing in there, but it's very, very thin. So I'm kind of just using both. There we go. Again, I'm looking at this and I'm looking at the photo and it's so rough right now. But it's meant to be. And it's important that we remind ourselves that it's okay. We are just building a foundation and we will get it to look great. We just need to trust the process, trust ourselves, trust the layering, and we'll get there. I feel like this with every painting though. There's always that stage where it's, oh no, what have I done? Maybe I should start again. But every time, it's okay. Works out. Grab a bit more of that. Here you can see it's a bit more thick and it definitely looks significantly more natural than these two. Though it'll really look natural once we have the oranges and we actually make it three-dimensional. Because right now, we're essentially just painting with these large, ambiguous silhouettes, right? They don't actually have depth yet. So we will get there. And it's not too far off. Now this cloud connects to this one, but comes up and it gets very thin in the middle here. It gets almost choppy. I'm going to get you a lot closer. I'm going to show you how we integrate a little bit of detail before we integrate that depth. Now the cloud starts to sputter out. We go from these large blocky shapes to lots of little pieces of cloud that amalgamate to create that same general movement and carry the eye from one side to the other, where eventually we do get a brand new cloud. But here I'm just going in with the little tip of my brush. It gets thin as we move towards the center here, and then it expands as we get to the other side. We start to create clusters, so we start having our little taps meet, and then eventually on the other side we can turn it into that full cloud yet again with a couple little openings and holes. And it's all about creating that gradient. And it's not a soft gradient, it's not a blended gradient, it's a gradient of texture. It's a gradient of repetition. And we can have these little drop clouds underneath, just add a bit more style and personality. We will also have, before we get to the depth, some very semi-transparent clouds. So I'll grab quite a bit of water on my brush, a little bit of our pigment. This is going to run its way through, or rather behind, some of our trees at the bottom here. Hi there, it's me from the future editing the video, and to be honest, the clouds in the sky look quite rough for the next half an hour. It's all intentional. We, with acrylics, need to build up those foundations and those awkward layers, but I really don't want anyone to get discouraged or quit because they feel like their painting doesn't look great, because it's not supposed to yet. Really, if you do everything right, it's still going to look rough. So I'm going to put an image up on the bottom of the screen for a little while, just so you can see what we're working towards. Keep you motivated, keep you recognizing that what we're building towards will look great. Don't lose faith in yourself or the process. You've got this, and this painting will prove that. So let's have some fun. We're making it quite transparent. That way we get those nice oranges showing through it. And it's just going to make these clouds look farther away from these ones. So while we haven't actually incorporated any depth on these yet, we are creating some depth in the painting just by making these visually appear a little bit farther away. And we can do another one just through that. Diluting the darker orange that we have at the bottom and just making things a bit more cohesive. There we go. But now it's time to work with some oranges. So let's head to the palette. So the orange that we want to create isn't necessarily like this. It's much more akin to what we have here. So I'll actually start with a little bit of that purple. We'll mix beside our initial mixture. That way we know that they are cohesive. We'll use double the red that we previously used. So that's a very red dominant pigment. We'll add our titanium white and Mars black, same way that we did with this one. And it should render something a bit darker. There we go. Now we need to actually make it red or orange. So we'll grab the Cadmium Yellow DPU. We'll do a little test. This could go poorly if we don't have enough of our red because of the Mars black and the yellow. So add a little bit at first and just make sure that works out the way you want. This is going to be a brighter portion of the cloud. So now we're going to brighten it with some extra titanium white. And if we lose saturation, we'll go back to our cadmium yellow DPU and work a little bit more of that in. Do a little test on the reference photo. And it's close, but it needs to be a little bit brighter. So more titanium white, more yellow, more red. There we are. So we know that the light is essentially coming from down here-ish. The light is going to brighten up the edge of the cloud. The back of it is going to remain darker because the light can only penetrate so much. But we will start on that nice edge. Work that along. I'm doing it in multiple strokes, as you can see. I have quite a bit of thick pigment on my brush right now, and that's just so I don't get a hard edge of the purple showing through the orange. And then very softly, I'll work my way up, just like so. Even though we have quite a bit of paint, it's still going to be semi-transparent, and we will get some of that purple showing through. I'll also grab slightly more of our cadmium red, mix that to the side, and I'll use this as a bit of a transition pigment into the purple, because red will just naturally work a lot better into purple than a yellowish orange will. And then I make my brush a little bit damp. We do a wet into dry blend where we start to bring it up. Not entirely, but certainly going to help the process. Grab a bit more of that. As I noted, we are going to have some orange coming out of this area. We'll do a soft blend of the two back here, very nebulously, leaving slight little pockets of the purple showing. And I'm actually going to, with a damp brush, go all the way up to the top, very softly, just so that we don't have any area that is entirely purple or entirely orange. It's all this kind of gradual mixture which brings it together. But now we do have some of the orange, which is just going to protrude by itself. Grab a little bit more water, just because we're getting a bit of a chalky effect. That typically happens when you have a lot more paint than you do water, and you don't necessarily have enough paint. So I'm just painting in some small clouds that I can see in the reference photo. These ones are orange because they aren't as dense. A lot more light can move through the entirety of them. They're going to add some extra depth and interest to the piece. We'll also have that orange working its way through a lot of these purple clouds, smaller ones that we have in the middle. And we'll reincorporate that brighter initial mixture on the very bottom of this cloud because it's a bit larger. And we can use this as a transition as well. We want to be careful though, not to use it too much. There we are. It's all about layering. Go back up to the top, go to the bottom of this one, go back to our red for the in-between, rather our red mixture. It's not actually a red pigment, it just has more red in it than the other one. This is actually quite orange in the reference photo, so we can have some fun with that. There we go. That looks really nice. We have some good diversity in our sky now. Definitely a lot of little areas to fix up, but strongly moving in the right direction. There we are. I'll get you a little bit closer for the detail work. Now, for a lot of these details, I'm going to be switching to a small liner brush. It's great for just filling in those little spaces that might be a little too small for the tip of that round pointed brush. And here, again, we'll just grab some of our nice orange mixture on our palette. Come down to this area, use my pinky finger to ground my hand. Come out from right here. I'll grab a little bit more water. Start to create a brand new, smaller cloud. Give it some dimension. You can see how it leans into that one. We can have this even have a little bit of a step going out to almost connect to it. Because we just did all of these larger, broad strokes, and now we need to refine here going into those edges, making much more clean markings than we were previously, and even coming up and doing the blends, incorporating little pieces of those clouds that can kind of come in and show cloud layering over cloud. Grab some of our red for the transition. It's very minimal, but that's what's going to make it look so much better. So, grab some titanium white, red, cadmium yellow. Just doing another little mix here. We'll do more for this cloud. Clean it up with a smaller brush. Clean this cloud up. And this is where things start to look pretty. Again, it's all about patience and trusting yourself to get to this point. because when you do, you'll be very, very happy you continued painting. But we do have to get through that awkward phase. I love painting little clouds like this, just connecting them, leaving open spaces. It's a lot like creating a little puzzle. Always have lots of little strands that come out and interact in their own neat ways. This area definitely still needs quite a bit of work. You can see a hard edge between the purple and the orange that we have. So we'll go up with the orange, softly, with lots of water. And then, maybe we'll grab a bit of our purple mixture from before, work that back on top. And now, we're not doing a wet into dry blend, but a wet into wet blend. Really smoothing it out, getting what we actually want. Over here, to the left-hand side, we can continue doing a little bit more of that by just giving the edge of the cloud a little bit of texture, not just making it a flat line. I think this will do a whole lot of good. Though, realistically, these trees are probably going to cover the entirety of this area. So, in this very specific scenario, it probably doesn't matter all that much, but it gives us more freedom in where we have the openings in our trees. Because now we won't have to feel like we are obligated to cover up an area, right? An area that just doesn't have enough detail. Love that. So while it's important to do a lot of that up close so you can really see the details, it's also important to take these steps back and just make sure that the painting as a whole is moving in the direction you want it to, that everything's cohesive, that your pieces are working together the way you want, because it's really easy to overdo an area and have it just not fit in with the rest of the painting. And in that scenario, you might think, well, that's okay, you just go and you add more to the other areas. And sometimes that's fine. Sometimes that works. But sometimes you don't want to add to those other areas. So it's a little tough. Here, though, we are following that initial idea of re-adding the purple to the top, re-adding the orangey red to the bottom, going in, getting those nice clean blends between the two. Trying to keep my hand out of the way for you. Sometimes the angles are just a little bit awkward and there's only so much we can do, but it's okay. There we go. A little bit more orange for the bottom. Also, something you can do if your clouds get a little too big, which occasionally does happen to me, might still happen in this painting, yet to find out. If they get too big, we can just go back to our sky color and work reductively. Paint on top of them once they're dry. That way we don't accidentally just make a big muddy area of paint. But once it's dry, you can go back, cover those areas that got a little bit too thick, and work backwards. I think I might be okay, but it's good to know that it's an option, so you're not too worried about it as you're working on your painting, right? We want this to be a fun process, not something you worry about. There we go. I'm going to be using the 1" yet again because we have a very large strip of space that we want to work with, and I want essentially the dark purple that we've been playing with so it matches the other purple clouds, though we might go a little bit darker and a little bit more saturated for this mixture because these clouds are closer to us, and as subjects get closer, often you can see their saturation, their innate coloring, a little bit better, as well as a deeper contrast. And that's simply the case because in the background you have a lot of reflective light. So I think that is fairly close to what we have right here, with the exception of being a little bit darker, a little bit more saturated. I'll head up to the top left-hand corner because there needs to be more paint in this left-hand quadrant. We'll start moving it across. Often, when I'm done mixing, I take all of the paint off my brush so that I don't have too much when I go in for detail work, but here, we really don't have to worry about that, as we need to fill in a very large space with really no detail. Now, as I get towards the bottom, I'm going to want a soft blend through here and over in the middle as well. So I'm applying less and less pressure, though you can see that my blend is quite chalky. You can see the tooth of the canvas through just about all of it. That's not what we want. I'm going to make my brush a little bit more damp. We are going to double up that initial layer, and then we're going to soften what we have there. We can do that in a couple of different ways. How we go about it all depends on the success rate of the first way and then the second way, and we can kind of progress through them as we need to. But we do have quite a bit of option. We can do wet into wet, we can do wet into dry. There we go. This one's a bit more saturated than the last. That's one of the big benefits of having to do multiple layers. You can make adjustments in between. Just make it a little bit better, a little bit more what you're looking for. And I think I actually want it to be a little bit brighter. I like the saturation, but we'll just add some titanium white. Try to include segments like this in the painting rather than me just getting the color right from the very beginning, just because I think it's a much better learning process to kind of see how and why I go about making these changes. I think that's significantly better. So now we'll go back to the round pointed brush. Make sure that's nice and damp. We'll need a bit of an orange, or rather a reddish pink that'll transition into an orange. So we'll grab our previous color, we'll add some red, add some titanium white, a bit more of that previous pigment. We don't want too much of this, but we definitely want some. We'll just walk that along the edge. There we go. Now, I'm going to make my brush quite damp. I'll use the edge of the brush, which again is rounded, and I'll work in a bit of a circular motion, blending the still wet purple down into it and it up into the purple. This is going to give our cloud a little bit of texture, though if you go very soft you won't see the brush strokes. I personally like seeing them a little bit, so I'm making them somewhat noticeable. Then as we continue to progress downwards, we have that. We'll make it more red, and then we'll add our yellow, a little bit of titanium white. I don't want to go in with that pigment the way it is on my brush, so I'm taking the excess off. I want to go in with a bit more of a watery variant, and I don't want too much on my brush when I do it. There we go. Just working away around what we've done. Trying not to pick up too much actual purple. I can pick up and work with the reddish orange mix, but want it to be subtle. Again, remember when this looked as rough as this does. So again, remind yourself, it's okay, part of the process. Here, going in with a wet brush, doing a wet into dry blend, Working my brush in circular motions, giving it that really nice, essentially warm light working through the clouds. There we go. And I think just a second layer will make that look pretty great. Though, again, don't worry about making this too far down, because remember, we can always just recreate that color and work it back up. With that, I'm going to let that dry, do my second layer, and then I'll meet you for our next step. Now, I wasn't going to include this.
Hey, me again. I know what you're thinking. That went from looking very rough to smoothly blended. How did that happen? Don't worry, I'm going to show you in 2 different areas. Let's jump into it.
Because I was really just doing more of what I was doing previously, but started doing a bit of a soft blend there with wet into wet, and I thought I'd show you exactly what I was doing. Here I'm using the 1-inch flat-headed brush. I've reapplied the purple at the top, I've reapplied the yellow down here at the bottom, that Naples Yellow and Titanium White, and now I'm doing an actual wet into wet blend, just trying to get something as soft as I possibly can. And I'm using the 1-inch brush still so that I can get a little bit of a brush stroke, a little bit of a movement in here. I think that it's creating this soft, nice effect that we don't really have in the background. And so I'll grab a bit more of that Naples and white. I'll throw that at the bottom here. Do a little bit of a blend upwards. Get that nice, soft transition. And you can have areas that kind of stretch inwards to show some additional depth within your clouds, but we don't want it to go in too much. There we go. Starting to get a hard line at the top there. Don't want that, so I'll grab more of my purple. And I just work both of these back and forth until I get something that I really like. That said, the brush is starting to get a little bit diluted from all of the white and the yellow, so I have to use significantly more of my purple up here to regain that initial color, maybe even re-interject some Mars Black. Lots of little changes that can be made, but in the end I went for a wet into wet by just reapplying both pigments, going back over them both numerous times, building up those layers. Here, just do a little bit more with this. And create these hard edges if you want them. Little clouds that have a little bit more light that kind of come up. Also an option, depending upon the amount of detail. But remember, we are going to have some pretty detailed trees here, so it isn't really necessary. And going over it with this brush very softly can just smooth out just about everything. Also, finger painting can be useful. Just make sure your hands are extremely clean. That way you don't have any oils on them that you transfer to the canvas. But really love that. In fact, I love it so much. I want to do just a little bit down here. So I'll show you how we go about that. We'll start with the Naples Yellow and Titanium White, just because it's a brighter, more delicate pigment than the other. You can see it's almost titanium white, really bright around here. We'll apply it, maybe a little bit more Naples Yellow. We'll apply it at the top of our sky, do a soft blend upwards, right above the cloud that we want to blend it into. Going to take off my excess paint, grab some of our purple. And then we'll do a very soft blend of one into the other. Use the corner of the brush when you just want detail. It's going to make your job a whole lot easier. Trying to work fairly quickly, which is why you can hear me just kind of bumping into the easel here and there. There we go. I don't want too much of this down here, but I want it to feel like it's all part of the same subject. Right? This is farther away. We won't quite get that effect, but we will get a hint of it. Again, just using the corner of the brush because it's a smaller area than what we have up top. And it just needs more of a delicate rendering. Now we're going to work on a transition between the clouds and the blues that we're going to have down in the snow. And we'll do that with a bluish purple cloud right through here. The blue we'll be using is an ultramarine blue. I'll put a little image of that up on the screen. And I'll be using a filbert brush. This one's about 1/3 of an inch. It has a fairly sharp edge, but of course rounded corners, so it's pretty versatile. With that, we are going to start with our ultramarine blue. We'll grab about 1/3, maybe 1/4 that in our purple. We'll grab about half that titanium white, nice and bright, and then we'll desaturate it with about 1/5 that Mars black. Get a good mix so we don't have some areas that are darker or lighter than others. Do a little test on my reference photo. It's quite close. I think I want slightly more titanium white in there. And now we'll head in using my pinky finger to ground my hand. And I want it to overlap a little bit of our trees and our clouds. Rather, our trees to be. Have this come down here, come back up. So it's a very unique shape. We have this protruding piece. This bottom area isn't completely flat. I'll have it kind of come out there. Bring it all the way down to the bottom, going back over this multiple times just to ensure it's nice and thick. And we'll bring this all the way across to where we'll eventually lose it. Applying more pressure with the brush to fill in the larger areas. And of course, softer, more delicate applications up in the tinier spots because we want less actual bristles on the canvas. Might want to do a couple of layers, and if you find you want it to be a little bit more blue or a little bit brighter, you can change that. You can make it darker by adding in the extra titanium white like I just did. I thickened the pigment quite a bit, which is making this application really nice. There we go. Next, we'll work on capturing this distant line of trees, not to be confused with the darker set, which is right in front of it. The first step, we'll be continuing to use the filbert brush. We'll grab quite a bit of Mars black paint, mix that right next to our previous mixture. Then we'll grab about half that in titanium white, mix it up into a nice gray. We'll go into our blue this time, very much making a blue dominant pigment with maybe 1/6 that of our purple. And we don't want it to be hyper dark, so I'll probably add a little bit more of that titanium white. Still quite a bit darker than our previous mixture in this area, so I like that. We know it'll stand out. apply that to the base. And then as I get towards the top, I'll just do a little drag up. Again, this brush has a sharp top to it, so we can create the very light impression of some trees. We're going to have more over here. We'll have a larger tree, more so in the midground, right there. Again, doing a lift, releasing pressure as I do. That way, we get a bit of a softer amount of pressure towards the top. There we are. And once that's applied, and done so with a relatively thick application, we are going to put that brush down and grab a smaller liner brush. This would be great for our details, and we can begin some of said details now. So here I'm going to pick the top of a couple distinct trees using that same pigment. We're not going to add too much detail, but we can do the general shapes. There we go. We want to do enough that it looks natural within this setting. They can be overlapping, and then we'll take a bit of a break space-wise. Get you a little bit closer for this side. Really up close here, grabbing some of that paint, picking a spot I want to be larger, starting at the top, applying slightly more pressure with the brush as I come down so that my stroke gets larger. And then I come back and fill out the sides. This is the distance, so we won't see much detail, but we do want a little bit. I'm using a fair amount of water to thin my paint, which occasionally means that my application is semi-transparent. Not a bad thing in this scenario. Just makes the trees look farther away when you can see that purple of the cloud showing through. There we go. Not much actual work here, but it does help the finished piece. There we are. I think it would be a fair assumption to assume that now that we're done with this line of trees, we'll move on to this one. But realistically, we want a lot of snow behind these trees, and it'll be a lot easier to paint this first and then put that over top of it. So we're going to create a color for our snow first. I'm using the 1-inch flat-headed brush because it's a very large area. I'll start with my Ultramarine blue right here. Grab about an equal mixture of that in our titanium white. We'll need to desaturate it, so we'll head over to our Mars black. We'll start with maybe 1/6, not much at all. And we'll do a very thorough mix. This will be for the darker blues. We can build lighter blues on top of it over time. We'll go in for a little test. A couple of different areas. This is naturally a little bit more purple, just because ultramarine blue is a bit of a warmer blue, but I like that because it means it'll mix well with our clouds. Here, I was fairly happy, so I'm just mixing a bit more of it. I always like to start with smaller amounts and then mix to the larger ones once we have something we're fairly confident with. And by the way, if you want a bit of a cooler blue, cerulean can be really, really nice. Normally when I go to apply paint right after mixing, I clean off my brush, but this time we are definitely not going to do that because we just want to cover a large area. We don't necessarily need the cleanest, smallest details. So we'll use what is on here. There's going to be a lot of lighter blues and snow texture in this area, but we need to build up the base first. Much like we did with the sky. Initially we had what looked like a very flat layer, and then over time we elaborated on it until it turned into something really, really beautiful. This will be quite similar. So I'm covering up a lot of the mounds that I drew in, as well as the trees that we have over here to the left-hand side. We will also have quite a bit of snow on the road, and I'm only going to go towards the edge of the first opening, just like that. We'll avoid the open areas where there will be melted snow and either ground showing through or very reflective puddle, depending upon what we want to do. And now we'll just start connecting the top and the bottom. Work in X-shaped patterns, so we drag the pigment from the top to the bottom and the bottom to the top. And once this is all complete, we can redraw in the mounds and whatnot, but we do need to make sure this is nice and dry and that we have a nice thick layer applied. Might as well also take this time now as we move over to that left area to grab a little bit of extra Mars Black, just darken it a hint because you're moving into a really shadowy spot. We'll apply that on the left-hand side of these trees. We'll have it come out there, follow the path, and we'll blend it into our current mixtures as well. There we go. That said, we do want to do 2 layers. We'll sketch on what we need to, and then we'll continue having some fun. So now I have everything lightly drawn in there. I am going to switch to the 1/3 inch filbert brush, and we'll take some titanium white and interject that into our previous mixture. This will brighten it up a little bit. It'll also desaturate it, so I'll also grab about half that in our ultramarine blue. This should render something quite a bit brighter, and we're going to begin with it in the far distance, and we'll slowly work our way towards the foreground. Not sure if you can hear it in the background, but it's a new day, and it's a very windy day. So we have quite the winter feel for painting. Always nice when that kind of lines up with the setting you're in. Though often I find I really like to paint areas and settings that I'm not in, so that I can kind of project there a little bit. So it kind of works out either way. But with that, as I move towards the foreground, I'm going to skip this area right here because that'll have a bit of a shadow from these trees. The light is coming this way, so we do need to be mindful of those. And as I start to get closer to us, I'm doing my applications with a bit of a tap and a drag, leaving exposed openings between a lot of these. And what we're really trying to do is create distant mounds of snow, some that are higher than others, and that means that there are peaks and there are areas that drop down that can't receive light and therefore are darker. This is how we're going to achieve some texture and depth in the background. That said, let's get you a little bit closer for it. So now, using that damp brush, using my pinky finger, we'll come back in, and when you apply this over previously applied areas, it will be brighter because the pigment is semi-transparent, and you will see the brighter pigment showing through underneath rather than the darker one. So do be careful with that. You don't want to make some spots significantly brighter. Really is windy. Wow. Maybe, perhaps I should dub from here on out.
So, as an update, I did decide to dub the next 20-ish minutes or so, and now, listening back in post, I recognize that the wind wasn't loud on camera, but it was incredibly loud in the room. So, something to note for the future. Probably don't have to do this. But the next step was working with that filbert brush. We're continuing to move into the foreground, and with that comes larger strokes to further emphasize the size of the snow mounds that we have here. I'm still leaving space in between these strokes, and I'm going over a number of them multiple times, very specifically though the tops of them, to further build those layers and make it look brighter, because again, the more we apply pigment to this new pigment, the brighter we'll get, because we'll have that brighter pigment showing through the bottom rather than that darker pigment. And here I'm starting to create essentially a division between our multiple mounds of larger snow. We have one to the right, which is still a lot of darker negative space. We have one to the left, which I'm slowly building up here. And then we have that one kind of leading us into the background. So a lot of dynamic movement, and we'll be able to further emphasize that later on when we incorporate smaller details with finer brushes, but also just more detail and light through additional applications. So here we're starting to work our way down that snow mound. I'm trying to have a lot of it have a slight curve to it. It's all leaning in towards the center-ish of the painting. That way we have a little bit of a fall, but it's not too steep. If you want your snow mound to look very steep, make your lines more vertical rather than horizontal. Mine definitely are on that more horizontal side, and this all does look fairly rough at this point, but that really is the process of working with acrylics, especially thin layers. Now we will switch to a smaller liner brush. This would be great for details. We're going to grab some additional titanium white, rework that into our previous mixture, grab some of our extra blue, add some extra titanium white, just trying to build up more pigment, but this time a slightly brighter pigment than what we were previously working with. I do take off that pigment and then grab new pigment with a more damp version of the brush, just so that I can get better sharp lines over time. And now I'm heading back into the background, finding the tops of those snow mounds, and we're adding this highlight to the tops of them. So this should start to give us some additional depth. It'll also begin refining what we've applied. Again, in the last part, it did look fairly rough. We didn't have a lot of solid form there. The brush strokes were very noticeable, and now we can start to clean that up. And I'm beginning this process from a bit of a distance, and I also tried to keep the camera back for said distance. That way you also get that similar perspective. But I'm doing that because it's so easy to get caught up in the detail work here and forget about making it progressively get larger as we move towards us. So the farther back we are, the more we have to take note of it. And that's why I'm painting from a distance, and I wanted to show you that. Here the lines are really starting to get long as we move into that mid-ground, foreground area. And we will continue with more of that. As you can see though, it's really finding previous applications and working on them. It's a very cathartic part of the process. We already have a lot of the harder decisions made, right? We're just kind of reaffirming them at this point with additional paint. And I'm still trying to stay away from that left-hand side. For the most part, we do want the majority of the highlight over to the right here. But with that, here we have a even closer look at the canvas. Again, not a super clean look yet, but we are getting there. I feel like I have to preface that a lot in this lesson, but it does turn out really, really well. And I don't want you to get discouraged while you're working on it, because you can create something really beautiful if you just kind of trust the process, trust yourself, and continue with what we're doing. But here I'm really highlighting the edge of that snow mound. Remember, the light's coming from the back, so the top of this and the edge of this are going to be illuminated. Same with the snow mound right here over on the right hand side, but the actual larger body of it's going to remain fairly dark because the light just isn't facing it. We'll get some reflective light, and there's a lot of reflective light in snowy scenes just because the primary subject is so reflective. But for the most part, the area that faces us on both this right and left snow mound is going to be darker. I am going to have a little bit of texture on there. And that happens when you don't have enough water on your brush, but it can be a great look for snow because it does give you that slight shimmer effect. You don't have to incorporate it, but I do like it, and I feel like the additional texture when we step back does work really, really well. So that's another small technique you can incorporate. That said, we are going to head back to our palette now, and I'm going to recreate the darker blue that we have in the background. You can still see it on the palette, so we have a good point of reference, and I do always try to keep a little bit of our recent color on the palette for remixing purposes, though here I'm trying to use the smaller liner brush, which isn't a great brush for mixing because it simply doesn't have many bristles. Often if I want a good deal of paint, I'll switch back over to the filbert or the 1-inch, but here I did want to show you that it is achievable with that liner brush. And here I did want that initial color in the background so that we could work this over some of the highlights that perhaps got a little bit too far back, and we can separate them a little bit. We can go over what we need to and just kind of clean up that area. But you can also add a little bit of a highlight to it and start building up really, really subtle snowmounds in the background as well. So you have a lot of option here, and it's definitely something I recommend going back and doing, if not to clean up that background area, but to just add a little bit of extra texture detail. You can see it right now. It's so subtle. There isn't much of it, and you can slowly build it up over time. But as you do move into the background, you do want less and less detail just because the eye can't recognize that much from that far away, though you do want that progression to be slow and to make sense so that you do create that additional depth. And at this point, I really like what we've got going on, though remember, if you do too much, it's very easy. You just go back to that initial color, cover it up, and from there you should be in a fairly good place. Here I'm just playing with a little bit of extra highlight and trying to further that larger transition. Though here we have a bit of a wider shot just to show you how it's progressing. We've had a lot of rough stages, but it is starting to come together. Still so much to do in the painting, but nice to have that kind of reassuring look at it. And now, yet again, we're heading back to the palette, mixing up a very, very dark pigment. Predominantly, it's Mars Black. You probably want 2/3 of it to be Mars Black. The other portion is Ultramarine Blue with a hint of Titanium White. And this is going to be for this tree line, which is closer than the back tree line, but also not in the foreground. So with this, I do want it to still have some blue because I want it to have that reflective light going on in the background. It'll also make the darker, more stark trees in the foreground pop later on. So we don't want a pure Mars Black here, and that's why you can see I'm spending so much time working on that mixture. Again, just trying to get something that doesn't overwhelm the rest of the painting and won't compete later on to a great degree. But here, going in, painting the vertical piece of the tree, and then we go back in and we tap on all of the little pieces, all of the branches and the foliage. I'm going to try to leave some spacing in between different branches and create little openings and holes. We're at the point where we won't see a massive amount of detail, but we will see enough to make the trees look distinctive. And that's really what's going to make the painting look realistic, especially in this area later on. So there's a lot of tapping. I find that with these, I like to stand really far back, maybe hold the brush farther back than I am. That's some advice I would definitely give. And that'll just give you a much more loose application, which is great for rendering more randomized trees, branches, really anything. You lose your control in it, which I know might sound intimidating, but it does ensure that you don't repeatedly make the same interactions in that subject, and that typically for a lot of people is great. Though remember, we can always go back and clean up areas if it just gets a little bit messy. I also try to make my trees not hyper condensed initially. I try not to add that much detail. I like to leave room room in between them so that we can go back and add it in later. Also, all of these trees have a slightly different height. You can see that the smallest is on the left, then it gets a little bit higher, and then it gets quite a bit higher. That progression is intentional. You do want them always to be differing, and you want their differing to consistently change. Also, I know that we're mixing a lot on the reference photo here. We have the actual drawing that's going on. Did think I would take a minute here to note that the traceable and the reference photo are up over on Patreon. Want to say a massive, massive thank you to everybody who is supporting the channel up there. You are making this lesson happen. This channel is predominantly community funded. Wouldn't be able to do it without you. Say it every episode. Want to say it multiple times every episode, but don't want to get annoying with it. But you definitely do deserve your thanks, and I very much appreciate it, and the fact that we're working on this here together today because of you and your support. Also, the reason there aren't 900 ads throughout the video is also because of you. So big thank you. If you are new to the channel, again, you can get the traceables, the reference photos. You can also get my ebook, Acrylics for Beginners, which is essentially the essentials, everything you need to know about acrylic painting before you jump into your first acrylic painting. We also have an exclusive Facebook group you can get access to up there where everybody shares their work. It's a great community to ask questions, to see different iterations of the paintings that we're painting here, to get your own ideas and see how you can take things, because people can get really creative, and it's really cool, and it's a positive space, and I really love what we built. But a lot of fun stuff up over on Patreon. Just a great way to say thank you and support the channel if you want to do that. But again, the traceables and the reference photos are up there. The reference photos also just linked in the description as well. So bunch of stuff that could help with the color mixing here. Again, we're not going with a pure black, and we are altering our trees quite greatly. So just something you might want to check out. Figured I'd mention that before the dub was over here, because it is going to conclude relatively soon. And I'm always really curious, do you prefer when I talk in real time about what I'm doing, or do you like it when I record everything and then we have a conversation about it like we are now? I feel like I've asked a couple of times in the past, and often the answer is like the real-time explanation, but you never know. Sometimes that changes, and I just wanted to know what your thoughts are in the comment section down below. But with that, here I am still working on that middle section of trees. All of them are still of a different height. I'm starting to apply them a lot more quickly just because we have significantly more practice at this point, though I'm not going to paint that larger block of canvas with the liner brush because it's simply quite small and it would take a lot of time. Instead, here I'm switching over to my filbert brush, again 1/3 of an inch. We're mixing up more of the pigment we just had, and we're filling that in. This brush is fantastic because it does have that nice sharp edge for rendering this bottom line, but you can also use the corners of it, which are rounded, to get some blends up into the trees that we've been working on. This does look a little bit darker, but that is only because it's still wet, and as it dries it should be significantly more cohesive with the rest of the trees. And through this tapping motion, I'm also getting a little bit of texture, which should show through in the long run. So I like that as well. Incredibly versatile brush, and it's kind of always amazing just how much of each painting is completed with it. That said, I am now going to move slightly over to the left, and I'm going to start with that blocking in basic block area first, though this one is a little bit lower, which means it's closer to us. This is going to give us some additional depth, though we'll work on it in a second. The wind does seem to be calming down, so we'll try doing this live yet again, but here we'll grab more of that dark pigment. We do have some trees right along this larger portion, but they're going to be covered for the most part by what we have in the true foreground. So we don't have to be as precise with these, though we do still want a lot of diversity. We want different heights. And we want to ensure that should portions of this show through,
they will still look nice and professional. We don't want any part of it to look lazy, or we don't want to kind of hinder our future ability to leave spaces open, right? The better this area looks, the less of it we have to cover up. So we can cover up only what we really want to. And that's really the larger goal right now. Here, I'll leave a little bit of a break between these two. Something I tried to accomplish on this side. Lots of little taps, a couple little drags. This is something we can also go back to later and really fix up. But if we get it done now, before we do those larger trees, it will be easier. There we go. And then we'll just run through this side. The way I tapped it on with the filbert brush ended up giving me an implied top to quite a few trees, so this won't be too tricky. We're just kind of finishing off the general ideas that are already created. And my brush is quite damp, as you can probably tell by the actual markings on the canvas, because a lot of these are semi-transparent initially. Go over them a couple of times, but you also don't have to do all of them, because having some of that golden light work through them can be really nice for depth and just establishing that they are pretty far away. There we go. See? That's much more transparent. And it does create a pretty neat effect. Makes it look farther back than the ones that we have there. From there, we'll take a step back and move on to blocking in with the 1/3 inch filbert. We're essentially just going to continue from where we were, and we can do so with a little bit of a tap upwards just to keep that general idea and motion going. As you move towards the left, we want our trees to get taller. We want them to get a little bit bigger because we are moving closer to us. And then as we essentially approach this area, we're going to find trees in the foreground, and those details will be rendered with the liner brush. So right now, I'm just going to apply more pressure with my brush to accomplish a larger stroke, and we can fill in all of this wider negative space, doing a slight blend into our past application just in case our mix is a little bit different. We do want it to be the same, or at least quite similar. Though as you move here, closer to us, it can get slightly darker. So if it's going to change in one direction, make sure it is that one. And we'll just fill this in, working with an X-shaped pattern to bring pigments from the top down and pigments from the bottom up. Grab a little bit of water so we can continue getting a good amount of surface area. This will essentially be in the true foreground, so we can mix in slightly more Mars Black. And then we'll blend it into the back. We'll have a lot of trees, sticks, a lot of details in this general area, but they're all going to be built on this initial, just very simple, currently unaesthetic piece right there. But that's okay. We build those foundations first, right? There we go. 2 layers is often ideal, but when we're working with such thick pigments, you might not have to. Now we're going to start working on the taller trees, and we'll do so with a liner brush. This is the liner brush I've been using for the majority of the lesson. This is the one I'm about to be using. As you can tell, this one's a little bit larger. I'm just going to do this for the base and the more dominant areas. Then we'll switch to this one for details. You don't need to use 2, but I do find that just having that variance can help. In the very least, at speeding up the process, which is important because I don't want this lesson to be forever for you, right? So we'll grab some pigment with this brush. we'll head up to the top. I have everything sketched in very lightly. Use those woodless colored pencils. Start at the top. And whenever we draw trees, what do? We make a lot of connected lines rather than a singular line from the top, because this is going to give our tree a lot more natural movements. And often your trees end up looking fake when you just go to the top and you run all the way down with a smooth stroke. There are some trees that do just look that naturally smooth, but it's not often. And the majority of the time, you'll get a much better piece when you do this. And we'll just have that come down and meet the bottom. Nice and easy. We'll plant our second one. All of these are going to have a bit of a tilt to them, which I think is nice. Rather than having it stand straight up, I'm just looking over at the reference photo, I'm looking at my drawing, doing a little comparison back and forth. This one is lower. And I can tell I need more water on my brush. So I'll grab that. Just move a little bit of paint out, water, paint. Don't want too much paint. It's really about finding that balance. This is a pretty full top. This one's a bit more open. Remember that your tree should get larger as you move down. This one has a bit of a more prominent move to it. There we go. That's really neat. I like that a lot. It's quite thin because of the water, so I'll have to go back in and thicken that with multiple layers. And then we have one over here, and that'll have a bend going in the other direction. This one's actually the tallest. Not going to make this bend as dramatic. There we go. I think all three trees look quite different, which is very much the goal. Now this one doesn't have two tops, but it almost looks like it has two tops, in that it has another larger branch that comes out near the top. And then I go into my taps to start filling this out with all of the branches. Again, I can begin with this brush and then move to the smaller one when I get to the really finite details. And with that, I think I'll get you closer for this next part of the process. Just clean that up. And then move you in. Now, the trees are very important visually for the painting, right? A lot of attention is going to be going to these. But what we really need to remember and ensure here is that we're not using a lot of color or variance. What we have right now is our line work, our applications, and the contrast that we have in the background. So we don't want to lose that background. So I'm going to paint initially slightly less detail and slightly less full branches than what I think there actually are or should be. And I'm doing that very specifically so that we can, over time, continue to add and gauge that at a place where we don't accidentally do too much, because it's really easy to add more of this foliage, but it's relatively difficult to get rid of it. It means recreating the colors and the textures that we have in the background, which is great practice, by the way. So if it happens to you, it's okay. I'm sure you will become a better painter because of it, but we will have to do a lot of extra work if these end up being too big. So I'm keeping openings between branches, keeping openings within clusters. Here's a cluster that moves over the front of it. Often I think people paint with the foliage going out to the left and the right hand side. but realistically it also goes in front of and behind the tree. That's important to remember. We have a lot of elongated branches here. Have these swooping motions. You can see just how much diversity there is in this tree already. I'm going to make the main body a bit more thick here. It's a lot thicker in the reference photo and on the traceable, but I'm going in with an abundance of caution. Brush again, quite damp. Let's do another sweep. This time I'm going farther out because as we get farther down in the tree, we have more developed branches. They've been alive longer. They've been building themselves for longer. But there's a certain point where we are going to want to stop that. And we're just going to closely monitor what we're doing. We want some to overlap. That's also important. You can see that these aren't going out to the same amount. A lot of them start high, they dip down, and then they come back up. That happens because the weight of the branch pulls it down towards the middle, and then the end of the branch is much lighter, doesn't have as much foliage, doesn't have as much of the actual tree, so it can bend back upwards. It's important, I find, to not only know how to paint something, but to recognize why it's being painted that way. I think that I became a significantly more efficient painter when I kind of came to that realization that understanding the painting and the subject was a really big piece of rendering it correctly and not having to redo it. That's why in these I try to not only talk about what we're doing and how we're doing it, but also why we're doing it. It's kind of like a little essay on art while we do our painting, which I know might not sound the most interesting, but I always loved writing essays just because it's such clear, concise information that you can take, learn from, and apply. And I think it just gives the best possible explanation. So I try to keep that in mind when I make these lessons. Often planning the actual lesson takes longer than making it. But hopefully that comes through in the quality and more so in the actual tutorial, right? Getting you to feel like you thoroughly understand the process before you jump into it. Or if you're working on it with me, as you work on it with me. Also, as we paint, friendly reminder, stepping back is really, really important for getting that wider perspective and just ensuring that you're not doing too much or that there might be an open area that you need to go in and start fixing. It's just so great for granting that larger perspective because I know I personally can get really caught up in the details and almost forget how they work with everything else when I step back and I say, oh, why isn't that working? Or perhaps that could have better synergy. Perhaps I need more detail there. I feel like that's very, very frequent. So here we are, a little bit farther back. As always, a little tip. If you hold your brush farther back, you'll be able to create a more loose stroke, create more randomized applications. It makes the applications harder, but when you have to render a lot of something and you need variance to make it look correct, it can be a really useful technique. There we go. And then we'll do some down here. You might say, well, we can't really see them. We can see it a little bit just because as we progressively move forward, this gets darker. You might not be able to see it on camera extremely well. But it is notable in real life to a small extent, and I would recommend you doing the same. But again, the branches do get smaller once we get past that point. Also, this was all done with the larger liner brush, and we will get into greater detail a little bit later with the smaller one. That's where we're going to have all of the really tiny branches which crisscross and add a lot of realism. Right now we're just kind of building the bodies, building those foundations. These are a bit more silhouette-like, and that's okay. They will evolve quite nicely over time. Leaving lots of space initially, just as we did with this one. I know, probably difficult to see the detail work from that far back, but what I really want to show you here is the amount of space I'm leaving between these two and the variance in actual clusters, the openings. That's another great way of creating variance. Here, we have a really big opening. Don't have that really presented on that side, so good way of distinguishing this as its own tree. Lots of little taps, and then right about here, as we start meeting that cloud, we start connecting, at least visually, with the other tree. This one's a little bit closer to us, so it's on top, technically. I'm going to try to preserve a lot of this detail because I like it a lot. So we'll have the tree start to expand more so here. Trying to leave openings between the two. We don't want this to essentially all become filled in. Remember to have those nice dips, to have things come up. Now we're at a very cathartic point in the painting. We've had some practice. We're getting faster at what we're doing. Things are really just building on each other. It's starting to look not bad. I think it has the potential to look really good. We're not there yet. We need some layers, we need some subjects, but we are getting there, and it's getting exciting. Very happy with everything we've done up until this point. Which I think is also quite interesting in that even if you do everything perfectly with paintings, often they still don't look amazing until that final 10-15%. So don't get discouraged if it doesn't look incredible immediately. You could literally be doing everything correctly. There we are. Trying to do a lot of crisscrossing. Really show the dimension here, because again, we're not going to have a wide range of values or contrast. So we need to achieve those through the line work. Create that implied depth. As I look to the reference photo, it's very, very notable how what I'm currently doing is a lot less visually full than what is on said photo. But I think it's working out quite nicely. And I think I'll get you a little bit closer just because you can already see, essentially here, I'll just make the markings, how close and far away everything's going to be. And I'll just fill in the gaps up into these places. Going to add a lot more foliage over here because we have this opening in the cloud that I want to preserve, and that means we can kind of play with our branches around it, have that as an opening. There we go. But I'll get you closer for the final details on this one. So here we are, a little bit closer. And we'll continue from this top area. I did note at the end of that last clip that we're just going to finish off the details here. These aren't the details. We are doing the details with a smaller brush, but we are finishing off the general form, which is important. You can see that I kind of work back and forth like that to a point. That way we don't often have these protrude on the same area on both the left and the right hand side. That's often not a great look for our trees. And if we can create more variance there, we might as well. Here, starting to get nice and thick so that it can be more thin on that side. There we go. Oh wow, the wind's really picking back up again. I hope that's not too noticeable on the microphone. Though, admittedly, in the past, I've thought a lot about incorporating nature sounds or the sounds of the city when we're painting street scenes, just different things to add to the atmosphere. But I wouldn't want them to be an intrusion. I wouldn't want them to be distracting. I want it to really build the atmosphere and make it more of an inspiring additive. Definitely lower volume. And I think it's something that I would add in post rather than play it through speakers while I do this, simply so that the audio quality would be a little bit better. Obviously something we haven't acted on yet, but it is an idea. And perhaps the wind is trying to be a little test for us here today. So let me know if you can hear it. Let me know if it's a bother. Let me know if you like this idea in general. We don't have to do it. And if we did, I'd probably run a poll after to see if it was enjoyed. But I would really like to continue adding to these lessons and make them something quite special. I feel like this channel started with the 10-minute paintings. If you've been here for years, you know what I'm talking about. And then we started to do slightly longer lessons, hour-long lessons. And now we do these, and these are probably 3 hours on average. But in them, we also show the mixing process and the different tubes of paint, close-ups of a lot of the brushes. But I think there are only so many things we can add in terms of the actual video. So maybe thinking about audio is a proper next step. These are looking really nice. I like that a lot. Again, getting more full towards the bottom, but not wildly full, so that I have room to make it more full in the near future. The very near future. Though that decision occurs from as far back as we can get, and we probably take about 5 minutes to really think about it, visualize it with or without the added details. Here I tapped on a lot of the ends of branches that I did not end up fulfilling. So we'll go back to these, and you know what? We can even make these ones come from this side. And we still have that nice little area of the cloud showing through that I really like. Often I recommend, even when you end up rendering something that you love, cover it up if it makes sense, but if you can make it still make sense while being there, then that's great. That's a win-win. Okay. So I think we take our steps back and we see if and where we need to really thicken things up. Now, to really assess how much detail we're adding, we are taking those steps back, looking at it from an afar, and looking at the reference photo here. We have a different type of tree and a post over on the left-hand side, and I think I actually just want more of this type of tree over in that vicinity. I want it to feel cohesive with everything else, but it'll also be at a different level, and I think it'll balance things really nicely if we change that. So I'm going to do that, fill that area in, and it'll give us a much better idea of how much detail to add to that. I don't think we have our answer yet. So I'll just put that reference photo down. We'll grab our palette. I'm using the Filbert 1/3 of an inch. We'll grab more of that dark pigment that we've been using. I'll head over here and just cover up initially the open areas of canvas that I still had. Do a little bit of a blend downwards. You can see because this is still wet, it's going to look darker than what we have down here, but as it dries, it will look significantly more cohesive. I'll take the excess paint off of said brush, switch over to our larger liner. Make sure that's nice and damp. And now we'll create more of these. I know we've been painting quite a lot of them in this lesson, but the more you paint them, the better you'll get, the more you'll have an understanding of the subject. They should just get better and better, and the next time you go to paint these subjects in another piece, it's just going to look gorgeous. So, hope that you are enjoying the repetition. I often find, because a lot of these paintings require a lot of thought beforehand, and there are changes that go on, so there's additional thought. I find the areas that are a bit repetitive in terms of application and texture actually just very cathartic. It's really part of the relaxing experience that I think a lot of us seek in painting. This is starting to dry. You can see that it's starting to really make sense within the larger area that was painted previously. And we'll just bring that all down. Not getting the sharpest tops because the brush isn't that sharp, but that's okay. We can go and add that finer detail with the smaller liner brush when we go in to that. But now, taking a step back, I think it's very evident that we can continue adding to this one. So we'll do so. Keep you a bit farther back, still in the beginning, just so you can see how we fill it out. I definitely want this tree right here to be more prominent, so I'll make some of the branches larger. I'll make some of the connecting middle pieces larger. Have that stretch out. And I'll have these two really bunched together. I also loved this little cloud here, but I think realistically I'm going to have to cut into it just for this all to make a bit more sense. It's a rather large opening for an area that is going to look very condensed very quickly. I'm also going to move some of the foliage and branches over from this to this section right through there. I'll have them connect to a greater degree up here. Go over different spots a couple of times just to build up that application because we are still using a pretty watery mix. Also want a bit more out of these. And the more we elaborate on this, the more we can elaborate on surrounding pieces, making it larger. Want more to kind of cut through. Really jumping around as we progressively add. There we are. Starting to look a lot better. Pre-detail. I think I also want another mini tree essentially coming from there. And we're going to add a lot of detail into this area with little branches, pieces of the tree sticking out. We'll do the majority of this with the smaller liner brush, but I can get things started with this one, having pieces that come up. Trying to get as small of a marking as I can as we get towards the top of each. And they'll also be protruding from the actual ground. Right from under that snow. This is going to give us a much more natural look. It'll make it more visually complex, but not necessarily messy. We're not playing with a lot of colors. so we don't have to worry about that. There we go. Really love how this is coming along. Again, something you want to do from a bit farther back, typically. Going in and adding smaller branches to all of that. Here we are, a little bit closer, still using that pigment, and I'm going to go over some of those previous applications. Just make them a little bit more thick at the base. And the second stroke here will also make them a lot thicker. Not only width-wise, but also opacity, which is really, really nice because it makes them feel more in the forefront. Starting to even add some larger ones that are a little bit farther out. Again, taking it slow. But these are going to add a lot of character to it long term. You want to make sure that you have your snow the way you want it before you do this though, because as you can see it would now be a lot harder to paint in that snow. And we're just getting creative with all of the little branches. There we are. We can also do little openings in the snow. We'll do more of these and make them larger in a little bit, but right now they're essentially going to look like little dots and squares amongst the rest of the openings at the bottom here. You can have really small protruding pieces and larger ones. Getting a lot of depth with the snow mounds and these little branches. Balancing out all of those darker pigments at the top. And I think with those in, we should darken that. Add a couple extra little pieces. Get them to be nice and creative. There we go. Just continues to evolve together. And it goes to show you that your subjects are never really done until everything's done, because we're always going back and adjusting previously applied pieces. Let's get a little bit lower. Now here we're essentially going to have the road, but right before the road we have these little pieces of ground that you can essentially see through the snow, and they're built up a little bit. So we're going to paint those in. These will also help balance all of the darks that we have on this side. And often you're going to want to paint the top as if the snow is dripping or is fallen over it. So we'll paint that, and then we'll assume there's more snow covering it that way, and we'll just fill it in. And this will be essentially an inset piece within the snow, a little bit of an opening there. Here we have a highlight, so I'm going to work on the left-hand side of the highlight. Create another little one. We'll create some little taps along the way in that general vicinity of different shapes and sizes. There we go. Looks a little bit awkward out of context here, being so close up, but when we take a step back it'll look really, really neat. It'll also look a lot better once we have the road. We'll also go and add one to the left hand or right hand side, give it a bit of a vignette effect. The eye innately travels to the brightest and most high contrasted area in a piece, in a photograph, in a room. And so by making the corners a little bit darker, we naturally move the eye in towards the center of the painting where we want the viewer to really stay. It's a bit of a subconscious trick. There we go. And we can add snow over the ones that we don't want, which I'll do when we do the actual road. So apparently, unfortunately, I was not recording when I painted these over here on the right hand side. They are the same as those, except these ones tilt slightly to the left. So these are angling inwards. These ones are angling this way. They all kind of point towards the center in a very subtle way. Some of these obviously also move back just so that it isn't incredibly obvious what we're doing here, but we're essentially just trying to create as many leading lines that move us in towards the painting as possible. And again, I wanted to balance the painting and the darks on the left-hand side a little bit more, so they were a good little incorporation. We'll add more to them though when we do the detail work with the smaller liner brush. That said, right now I'm going back to the 1/3 inch filbert. I'm going to go to the darker mix that we've been using for all of these, and I'm going to add quite a bit of additional Mars Black into it. And then we're going to take said Mars Black and work it into the bottom left-hand corner. Now, everything that we're painting right now is going to probably be covered up. We are going to be applying a reflection of sky, and we're going to be applying snow. So, we're just creating a very simple base, but what's neat about this is it can kind of connect to little portions of the openings that we just created with the liner brush. And the road can extend a lot out here. Really gives good extra context to those little spots. Grabbing more pigment, the road ends up winding all the way back. Road should get smaller as it gets farther away because of perspective, but we won't really see that just because of how the image was cropped. Instead, I'll make my brush a little bit more damp, and we'll also fill in these openings that I created earlier. There we go. And have those kind of lead into the background. And of course you want to do 2 layers. So, I'm going to let this dry, do my second layer, and then we can start working on some of the next details together. Once that is nice and dry to the touch, we will continue using our 1/3 inch filbert, and we'll remix some of the darker snow that we had. So we'll begin with our ultramarine. We'll grab maybe 1/5 of that Mars Black, half of that titanium white, and I think this will probably be a little bit too gray, so we'll re-interject the blue back into it. Go ahead down here, do a little test, and that looks very, very close. It's slightly darker, so again, slightly more white. That should get us what we want. Perfect. Now, here we'll essentially have a tire track, and then we'll have an area of snow that doesn't have said tire opening up the space, right? So we'll come through with this. I'm going to do lots of little taps, and I'm going to do a lot of horizontal strokes going both ways, as you can see. We do the longer stroke towards the right hand side of the mound because the mound is moving up, and then we see that top of the mound but we don't see the other side, so you only see that almost straight top of the mound. So we're just paying attention to that, and then we move our snow on over, make it nice and three-dimensional. I'm painting the easel apparently as well. Tend to do that quite a lot in these. We can tap on some extra snow just to make these seem a little bit more natural. You can do it on the tops and the bottoms. Snow working its way in and kind of draping over, right? We'll have both effects. Definitely makes it more natural. But with that, we're going to need to go back, thicken some of these applications, because realistically, they're not all going to be as thick as we need them to be with our first part. And then I'll add some little protruding areas as we get farther into the back. I'll make this smaller and smaller. There we go. It's a little bit messy back there because it's just not used that much. And then I'll do the other side of the road, which we won't actually really see here, but we'll get a little bit more snow post other tire track. And if you make this too big, it's okay. We can always work backwards, but I think that's a really good start. And now, we'll just make it slightly brighter. Go back. Add a hint of highlight here and there, just to the foreground area, the area that's closest to us. And we'll have it dissipate right as we get to here because we'll have more shadows, less light moving through. There we go. You can re-incorporate some of that up to the top, should we want to. But with that, we're going to let all of this dry. We're going to clean our brush. We are going to clean our dish of water because we need to start working with oranges again, which means we need to start working with yellows again. And if we mix yellows with a dirty blue brush or dirty blue water, we will get green. So we'll clean everything up, head back in here, start brightening this up, making the cool scene feel nice and warm. We are back. The ground here is dry, and we're going to proceed with the larger liner brush. As you can see here, we don't actually have any reflections from this moving through all the way to the foreground, but we're going to take some artistic liberties here. I feel like there's a little bit less of a space there, and the majority of this tree is blocking that, but we actually have the road extending out much farther than it does in the reference photo. So we are going to add some light and some warmth to the bottom here, and we'll do it creatively. So I'm going to start with a very heavily red base, a little bit of our Cadmium Yellow Deep Hue. We'll add the smallest hint of Mars Black, and I do mean the smallest hint. You can see I'm taking off the excess elsewhere. A little bit of Titanium White, and we'll mix up a nice medium orange. We'll test it up here, make sure that it works within the rest of the painting, and I think that actually works quite well. We just need to make it a little bit brighter, though this will actually be darker than what we have here because it's going over black and it's semi-transparent. So we'll start by saying we have some melted reflective water down here. Perhaps it's ice and it's cutting the reflection. Regardless of the case, we want this predominantly towards the right hand side because the more we get to the left, the more this light is going to be blocked. So something I like to do is I move up with my brush and just make sure I'm not moving too far over. Do little tests like that, working in horizontal strokes for the most part. And then as we get towards the left-hand side, I'm going to use slightly more water on my brush to make it a bit more semi-transparent. And I'm going to make these reflections significantly less full and more spaced out. So it's almost like little portions can be seen through the light, but certainly not grand amounts. Sorry, through the trees. We're in the process of just kind of plotting this on, and because I can't go off the reference photo, I have to figure it out as we go. So just looking for those more open areas and expanding upon them in the ways that we do. Now we'll go in with a little bit more than double the yellow that we used previously. We'll use some extra red to ensure that it remains nice and far from green. Titanium white to brighten it up. But we really want something that's brighter than last time. Something that's a little bit more yellow than last time. And we'll just make sure this fits within the context of the sky. Certainly does. We'll come back down here. Throw this towards this middle area. Little portions piecing out towards the sides. Can do some finger painting, should we need to. And we can also take it and tap hints of it into what we have kind of reaching out throughout this. Lovely. There we are. Okay, now we're going to continue brightening. So titanium white and making more of a nice golden yellow. There we go. Heading back into the center. And now we're getting some really nice pigments. We'll just do a little test. Perfect. Matches where essentially the sun would be in close proximity to. We can have it kind of shimmer to the sides. Do little taps to create that effect. There we go. And a couple little taps in with the rest of the water. Brighten once more. Don't want to overdo it, but the more layers we create in this, the more interesting it'll be. There we go. Really beautiful bright bottom. Now I thought about it, and as we move towards the back, I actually want a bit more of our reddish orange, just to act as a bit more of a transition, so it isn't too stark. So we'll get that, reincorporate it through here, just like so. Now we'll reintroduce more red. It's almost a red mixture at this point. Again, slowly moving that back. Little taps of it here and there as it'll be shown through the trees. And then what will really start making this feel cohesive and connected is, because this is predominantly now a red mix, we can grab some of the purple that we used in our clouds, work that down in here, there we go. We'll continue to add purple. And this will just add a really neat element to the bottom that'll connect it more so to the top. Grab that purple. We'll go with some Mars Black and Titanium White to desaturate it, but also darken it a little bit, so that we can kind of trail off into more of it. Now this implies that there is a lot of water. You don't have to have this much. You also don't have to do this step. But something I really, really love. I think maybe we'll make it a little bit brighter first. Just have more of a transition. There we go. And we'll just throw hints of that into the back. So now we'll pull the camera back a little bit, make sure that this all kind of makes sense within the context of the rest of the painting. It is more saturated than anything we have up here, but that typically makes sense. The closer we get atmospheric light, the more we get to see the innate coloring, though it is a reflection, so it's interesting. We may dull it down a little bit later, but that's dependent upon detail and if that becomes too distracting. If the detail can balance it, it's fine. If the detail can't, then we should probably lessen it, do a little bit of a glaze, something of that sort. But I really like it as an individual subject. And now we're going to add some highlights to this because we have an idea of how bright that is. So for this, we'll grab some of our titanium white, preferably in a clean spot. It's getting difficult to grab from there. This is all dry, by the way. I get a lot of questions as to how I keep the pigment wet on my canvas as I paint. Often I do not. A lot of this is dry, and I simply add more. Then I clean my palette with a paint scraper. It does leave scratches, but eventually I do replace them. I know that's a fairly common question. We don't actually talk about all that much. But here we're grabbing just a small hint of blue and abundance of titanium white. We're going to have the smallest hint of our Naples Yellow as well if you want to give it a little bit of warmth, but you do have to be careful of those greens. And you definitely can't do it with the Cadmium Yellow DPU because it's just far too saturated. And now I'm going to go towards the top of the snow mound because it's going to be receiving the most light and we're getting the most contrast in the foreground. Working around these little branches, we'll have it come down some of the areas that we've previously painted that give it form and shape. Trying to render fairly sharp edges. There we go. Little taps can often create a really nice detail. A little bit more. We're going to have hints of it showing through here, but we have a lot of these smaller branches that we have to work around, which is why, again, it's nice to finish this and have it exactly how you want before you get to this, but we could always just repaint the branches, so it isn't really an issue. We do need it to really calm down as we move towards the left, though, because, of course, we're just getting a lot more shadow. And we can move that down into here very slightly. Don't want much of it, because the more we add, the less special the foreground will be. But it balances the painting. So we're looking for a little bit, but not a lot. Yeah. There we are. And I'll do some little taps just to get essentially a bit of a sheen, a shine. Always like this effect towards the end. There's not much paint on my brush. Just trying to get those really sharp little applications. If it's getting a little fuzzy, then that isn't really what you want. And we'll also take this and we'll just add a hint of it down here. Have it dissipate as we move towards the left-hand side, as we've talked about with the reflection and the snow previously. Little hints of the highlight showing through though. There we go. Love this. Really coming along. Here, we'll get a bit of a slightly darker blue. Hint of Mars black. And now we need more titanium white. It's always a balance. But we essentially want something brighter than the darker blue that we have here. And we're just going to add a slight highlight underneath all of these darker markings that we have. That way it looks like the snow is kind of protruding up from the bottom there. Gives it some extra dimension. So from there, we are back to getting real close. I'm going to be using the smaller liner brush. We'll be grabbing that same dark pigment that we've used for all of our foreground. I'm going to use my pinky finger to brace my hand. And now finally, we can come in and work those very intentional, tiny details into our branches. This seems like a tiny thing. We've, painted so many branches already. We were already using a small brush, but now we have that so we can see just how much detail we have to balance essentially. And we can make smaller markings than we did before, so the offshoots to these branches are going to be even more interesting. We're going to thicken different portions that need to be thickened, which is going to have a big effect on it. So there are multiple things that are occurring here that are really going to aid the painting long term. And often talk about how the painting really doesn't come together and start looking great until that final 10-15%. This is where that happens. This is where we take something that looks good, turn it into something great. Love this step. Love that we're working on subjects we already know very well. We're quite familiar with all of these application processes, the movements, the palettes. Now it's refining and ensuring that we really did learn something, right? We go back to what we've learned, but we do it a little bit better. There we are. I love doing this. Lots of crisscrossing. You can see that my branches are very unique in shape. A lot of them are pushing this way, but we also have some that kind of lead us back towards the left-hand side. That way it's not too obvious that we are creating these leading lines. We will have some over on this side. Quite a good number, actually. Really want to do what we did over here, so lots of little taps on the bottom, elongated strokes, strokes that intertwine and go over each other, different lengths. This side definitely needed it. Is it looking a little bare in comparison? There we go. And it doesn't have a thick one yet, so there we go. Okay, much better. We'll head over to this. And I want to be careful on this side because it's fairly open and we don't want to overdo it. That said, I'll get you a little bit closer and get that in focus. So here, I'm going to use even more water than I was before. Slightly less paint because no strokes down here are going to matter as much as what we are currently doing. I'm essentially extending a lot of the previously applied ones as their tops just weren't that sharp due to the constraints of the brush we were using. So now we're filling those in. Lovely. Thickening that portion. There we go. Really looks like a cold winter branch, doesn't it? We're getting so close to that look. If you were painting this to the point where the sun was just slightly more up, you could also include slight highlights of orange and yellow onto the tops of the snow and onto the tops of the branches, the icy areas of them. I'm not doing that because I want this painting to work in a series with another painting, which I'll show you at the end of this lesson. And the other one is at that time. So I want this one to look like it's maybe 20 minutes later. And the sun, there's this progression and there's this changing of the snow. That way they're interesting together. They work really well together, but they're not exactly the same, and therefore they are, more captivating in a room. It's not once you've seen one, you've seen both, but rather, oh wow, that really opens up and elaborates on the setting and the story that's kind of occurring, right? Always fun to think about how you're going to present your paintings within a room and how you're going to complement them as well, if not through furniture and wall color, but other paintings. Like that a lot. Just do a hint more, and then we'll head up in the painting. So this is something I've wanted to do since almost the beginning of our lesson, and that's really build out the smaller branches, the individual pieces that just weren't achievable with that other brush. Lots of little taps on the ends, sharpening the pre-existing edges, but also adding in additional little branches. Trying to keep my hand out of the way for you here so we can really see what we're doing together. This is going to extend them a good distance, and if you haven't already painted these, if you're not painting along but you're watching this first, something you might want to consider is leaving a couple millimeters when painting all of this. That way you can come back and make them exactly the size that you want rather than extending them farther out than you might have wanted to. Often the extension will look really nice regardless, but you can go into it with slightly more planning should you want to. And again, just leaving space is the ideal way of going about it. Here adding in a whole new branch. Little pieces that bunch off. Make this a whole lot more unique. You can see I'm doing that with a number of them. Really like the elaboration. I feel like it's turning it into a much more natural looking tree. There we go. Trying to make each branch unique so they all have these funny little movements. And often they look a little out of place until the one right below it is painted. And slowly the tree comes together and becomes exactly what you want it to be. Big, cohesive, natural subject within your larger piece. You can also have these smaller branches work their way through pre-existing openings. That can always be a great look. That said, you do also want to paint quite a bit of this from a distance because you don't want to hyper focus to the point where areas just don't connect with each other anymore. So, in just a second, we will pull the canvas back. Pull the camera back from the canvas, rather. and take a wider look. Now, from a distance, I think it's looking really nice, but I still feel like there could be some work done on the edge of these branches. I can tell that extending them out was the correct call. Just trying to move this darker subject out towards the rest of the painting so that it doesn't feel like it's dragging the eye one way or the other. But additionally, we have a couple of real opportunities. We are working with a very dark pigment, and we have very light colors in the sky. Not where the clouds are, but elsewhere. So these are the spots that you're really going to want to pay attention to and do as good of a job as you can. Use your most creative ideas and movements. When we move over the actual cloud, our markings won't be as notable. So this is where we really want to do our best and ensure that we have those sharp, unique details that make the painting look natural, but also special, right? Head back to our palette, grab a bit more, thicken different portions, make them as sharp as we can, using as minimal pressure with the brush as possible so that we get the smallest marking. There we are. Lovely. Now we're heading down into the clouds, so a bit of a safer area, but one that still deserves a lot of attention and intricate work. Though at this point, it's worth noting, we are on the touch-up phase. So that's going to look different for just about every one of us. Some people want to go back and add extra little details to the clouds. Some people might want to take out details on the clouds. Some might want to add more highlights. Maybe, again, changing the time of day slightly so you have more of those reflective colors in the sky down in the snow. So many different options. But we always do a keyword towards the end of the videos, just as a little marker of the fact that you made it this far. Generally, only 13% of the audience does, so if you are one of said 13%, congratulations. I think that it's wonderful that there's a community that is as interested in painting as they are, and the fact that you are willing to sit through a probably 2-3 hour lesson, I think that's really special, and I think it speaks to the fact that you are going to do great. Hope that you feel like you picked up a lot of different things. But our keyword that you can incorporate in the comments is winding. So we have a winding road. You can use that in a sentence. You can just put the word itself down there. But it'll be a little indicator to me and everybody else who reads the comments that you were, again, one of the dedicated few who did make it to the end. It's a little badge of honor, essentially. But always fun to see who does that. Also, would like to say another big thank you to everybody who does support the channel up directly over on Patreon. It's because of you that we are able to do the lessons like this. And if you're new to the channel, of course, up there you can get access to the traceable for this, help make the drawing process a little bit easier. The reference photo, you can print that off, use it to test your colors on before you commit them to canvas and kind of get those mixes really as perfect as they can be. You can also find my ebooks, including Acrylics for Beginners, which is essentially the essentials. Everything you need to know about jumping into the medium. Bunch of ebooks full of traceables. We have an exclusive Facebook group where everybody shares their work and you get to see different renditions of these lessons. Often I think it can be really inspiring, even to me, and I feel like I get a lot of cool ideas about expanding on lessons. A really good community. So a lot of fun things up there if you're interested. It's also just a great way to support the channel and say thank you. But also, if you can't, it's no worries at all. We have a great community that does take care of us, and not everybody is always in a position where we can do that. But again, big thank you to everybody who does. You make a massive difference for this channel. Ensure that we don't have to put ads throughout the entirety of this. So, big thank you. I think I could paint branches forever. I could just talk and paint branches. It'd be wonderful. It'd be a great life. Pretty fantastic that I get to live so much of it right here. Just so many potential details to add, and all of them just keep making it look better and better. But at some point, we do need to put down the brush, very specifically, so I can edit this and get it out to you. So you can learn and have just as much fun as I did through this lesson. So I hope you do feel like you learned something. I hope you feel inspired, ready to go out, create your own piece. And again, as always, big thank you. I will see you soon with a brand new lesson. I already have the reference photos picked out. I'm excited, but see you soon. And above all, as always, stay creative.